I've noticed a theme recently of a question around establishing a food forest, and specifically, people have commented they've seen lots and lots of examples of how to take an existing lawn or open early succession bare space and grow it up into a food forest. What does it look like if you have an existing canopy that you want to modify and introduce more edible, more medicinal, more resilient and diverse plants? So I'm going to share some notes about that today. Where we will be looking is our 6-acre site that is in Trumansburg, New York. This has been worked on since 2009, the spring of 2009. So this is an 11-year site coming into its 12th year. And 4.5 of the acres were complete overstory. And the remaining property, an acre and a half, was mainly lawn. And that's what surrounds the house. And you can see we spent a lot of time and energy in taking the lawn and moving it up into succession. So this is a 10-year-old start of a food forest. And here we replaced the lawn in that whole area. That's our original nursery from way back when. This was all lawn and is now moving up into nursery production and mother plants to take cuttings from. But what about the existing canopy? You've got a few acres of pine trees. You've got some ash that are dying from emerald ash borer or hemlock that are having issues. You've got an overstory of not too many diverse trees, and you'd like to see some stay, some go, and what happens underneath. I think for context, it would be helpful for us to look at what we could call a quote-unquote before. In other words, what did it look like when we first started managing this space back in 2009? Now, unfortunately, I don't have any video or photos of that, but fortunately, what we do have is our neighbor's adjoining property, which today in 2021 has the exact same look and feel as what this property had in 2009. So let's take a look. Right now I'm at the southern end of our property here where it's nice and open, although we've got these sun traps, which I'm going to talk about in a little bit. But if I look to the southern boundary, you can see the brush wall, the living wall and brush wall that's laid up. And as we go through this brush wall that the deer use extensively, we can enter into our neighbor's land. And this gives you a very good feel. Imagine we had about 5 acres of this context, more or less. Little variation here or there, but what we've started out with here was a really strong overstory of Scots pine or red pine and a very dense shrub layer of very challenging plants. European buckthorn, like you've got right here, Japanese honeysuckle, robust and weird vining layer, a lot of unhealthy plants going on, very little food production. So if you can imagine, this is what we started with over about 4 to 5 acres of the main edible acres site. And so imagine that context over time being shifted into this open context with a whole lot more production going on. And we can point out some plants in here. But now I'm looking due north to the northwest corner of this property. You can see all the way over to there. There's a massive avenue of sun arc that can sneak through here to get to all of our production beds on the west end of this property, but with a really strong buffer for wind because we did not clear cut everything. We selectively scalpeled our way through with light thinning. And I really strongly believe that that is one of the first things I want to convey in a thorough way to anyone that maybe you just recently purchased property, or you've had property for a while and now you're ready to start doing some conversion and management to make it more productive for you and for your needs. Really avoid the broad stroke clear cut. Do not bring machines in if you haven't had time on the property. The little bit of thinning here and there, the little bit of digging here and there, actually is going to give you a lot of good information, and it lets you ease into the property without making destructive decisions that are incredibly hard to repair. So even though we've got this area, for example, that's now about 1.5 acres of very clear and open, this was not just clear cut in a day. It wasn't, skid steer ripping up trees and machine work. This was about 2 to 3 years of carefully and thoughtfully cutting a little patch here, a little patch there, weaving some of the material onto our property line, saving some of the tops to render into biochar to fold back into this place, caching any and all of the tree stems that could be useful. So it's another important thing to think about is understand what the plants are that exist in your landscape. And if you're going to be cutting them down to get more light and air for other things, what can you do with what remains? So all throughout the woods, there are these ash stems that are stacked up, and I have them here drying so we can use these for roofing members for little structures. Keeping that in mind, what's the intrinsic value of the parts you're cutting down? How can you save them and fold them back in later? And if you're in the northern hemisphere and in a cool climate like ours, we are in central New York State, and so there is a massive amount of benefit in not clearing to the due west and due north in our region. So even though I cut out, 50 or more Scots pine in this whole area, if you can imagine, this was entirely a pine canopy, just like this area to the south in here. So imagine it filled like that, even though I did some thinning in there too. But what I would never do is want to cut down the overstory that is the westernmost or the northernmost in our cool northern hemisphere climate. That is an immensely helpful windbreak for the strongest, coldest winter winds. But that sort of design technique does not have to be on the broad acre scale. Let's say you've only got a quarter of an acre or a half acre. It could be a small slice where you're opening up an aperture to the south. So in here, I'm looking due south into our neighbor's land. I cannot cut any of those trees because that's on their property, but the spring and summer sun comes easily into this garden area. And so we're getting lots of early morning light from the east, thinned out some of the canopy. In here, we left this huge, beautiful oak out of respect. There are not many, if at all, oaks on this property. And so even though we could potentially get more light into these gardens if I were to cut it, that absolutely must remain. But from that oak, if I'm looking to the north and east, to the north, and now the north and west, you can see that this opening in here, which is a production space for our nursery, there are air prune beds that are growing hazelnuts. We've got in-ground beds that we're growing garlic, and we'll be doing cuttings and things. This is a beautiful little sun trap in here. We've got the miscanthus that's blocking wind that may come off of the field to the south, but to the west and the northwest, the pines that were here remain. And so we sacrifice a little bit of late day sun in the midsummer, but most plants are pretty saturated with how much sun they want by mid to late day anyway, and it helps to cool off and relax these plants in the late day, but it protects this whole scene immensely from heavy winds and heavy snow exposure during the winter. So the concept here at whatever scale is to think about the scalloped entry into the existing canopy. So if I'm looking north, to clear a little block, but leave the west, leave the north, maybe the northeast, and let the sun enter and bounce around and be absorbed and buffer the space from winds and snow. I think it's easy to get stuck on the idea when you have a pretty dense overstory, let's say, a whole bunch of sugar maple, or there's a bunch of beech on your land and not a whole lot of direct sunlight coming into it. The thought could easily go to, well, I've got to clear all this before I can plant anything, because there's no way I can put an apple or a peach in if there's this much shade. That is maybe true, but one thing you could think about is on your way towards doing the clearing over the next few years, how do you introduce shade-tolerant plants that can give you a crop in the meantime and are happy with the shade the way it is? And so I'll take a look in this little area. Right now I'm walking north. So again, the pattern is there of a little open glade, perhaps an 1/8 acre in here, that is flanked pretty intensely to the north with the existing overstory trees that were in this landscape. The ash trees on the northwest were left. The cedar was left. The pines were left. And in fact, I added some bamboos to the north to be a little bit more of a windbreak. And in this little microglade, it's pretty darn shady in the summer months once the ash and the cherry leaf out, but yet in this glade, there's enough sunlight coming in that currants can be very productive. And so we've got this block of 2 different varieties of black currants and some red currants in here. And even though I would say they only get about 4 hours of direct sunlight in the summer, because of the amount of overstory that's in here, they're still quite productive. Now there's no rule that says I can't, in the middle of this currant patch, perhaps plant a grafted apple or a northern pecan or some next succession overstory tree that would want more light, and let it struggle a little bit, let it start to work its way up into the canopy, and over the next few years think about thinning out the ash here, perhaps the ash here, or not. I can monitor them and see if they actually need it. Because in fact, this wasn't even my planting, but this tree right here, which is now about 7 feet tall and beautiful scaffold and form, is a bitternut hickory, which was planted by some sort of rodent, probably a squirrel. You can tell from these mustard flame looking buds on the tip there. And this would be a beautiful overstory tree. It'll produce oil that we can press in the future. And one way I assess whether or not I need to modify the canopy around these trees is I look to see how much are they leaning and struggling in order to grow. And I can see a very faint lean to the south and west. It's leaning to where there's a little bit more light, but it's not leaning like crazy. So I don't know that I have to modify anything in the canopy if my goal is to see this bitternut hickory thrive, these currants thrive, and maybe a little more diversity that we can add in this spring. Speaking of assessing keystone trees, keystone shrubs for how much lean they have, how much you need to intervene to keep them alive and to survive, this is a great example of the other end of the spectrum, is this beautiful apple right in here that you can see is leaning crazily to the south. You might say, well, what the heck? Why is that leaning so much to the south? It doesn't seem like it has much competition. That's almost a 45-degree lean. But if you can imagine, about 3 years ago, this poor apple in here was completely surrounded by Scots pine, had almost no direct sunlight, and was leaning to the point where the bottom was almost ready to heave out. It sent up lots of suckers down low, so it may end up needing to be cut. But it's a very, very good apple. I'd like to preserve it. I cut down the competition in the form of those Scots pine canopies. We made charcoal out of some of the tops, and you can see all through here now on contour, because this is a relatively wet area. We took the stumps of those trees, laid them out on contour, mucked out some soil from the wet, boggy soil just upslope and deposited on them, and converted the bodies of those trees into what will ultimately be some incredibly productive hugel mounds, releasing the apple to get a bunch more light. And even though we killed a number of trees in here, this opens up to a crazy amount of potential production. We'll end up with way more trees in here, but way more diversity and resiliency as well. Another layer of value in making decisions around clearing that I think I would like to offer up is you can kind of see the example of this here. Right now I'm looking due east back towards the home, which is right along the road. And there's this kind of silly, well, in some ways it's beautiful, in some ways it's silly. It was planted here, Scots pine and white pine kind of avenue. And I've left it, what I have done is in between the Scots pine on the south side, I've planted English walnuts because in the long run I think they'd be more valuable. But I did not cut these trees down because the walnuts are to the south, and so they'll be able to get enough light to get the ball rolling. And again, I'll watch them. If they lean super hard, I'll intervene. If they're not leaning, I'll let it all go. But what you can see is that letting these trees, even though I've done a fair bit of clearing in here, letting these trees be tight enough that there's a continuity in the canopy is pretty valuable as far as letting squirrels move through your landscape. So in an ideal world, thinking about clearing that still leaves canopies touching, it allows for squirrels to move through. It helps unify the canopy so not single trees are not dealing with wind loads independently. They can kind of work together with their canopies enmeshed. So clearing to just have single trees standing on their own is asking for them to get blown over in a windstorm, but it's also reducing the potential for squirrels to move through, for birds to be able to hop in and come out to enjoy harvesting fruits that you're growing or bugs and be able to get back into the canopy. It's the edge repeating, but with a continuity to the edge. There's a lot of value in that. I feel like I could probably go on and on about observations after these years of light thinning, canopy opening, canopy continuity, and that kind of thing. But it's a long video already, so I'll leave it here for now. Let's ask some questions in the comments. Maybe folks can share notes about what they're doing to convert an existing overstory into something that's a little bit more diverse and resilient and productive. More important than anything is to get out there and start doing some very light modifying. Maybe you're working just with hand pruners and a handsaw, a shovel to move some soil here or there, just to see how things react. The more patient you can be, the more iterative you can be, the more the observe and interact model can talk to one another, and the better your overall design direction can go. Ask lots of questions of your landscape. Is it snowing and windy? Take a walk. Where is the snow piling up? Where's the wind whipping through? Where do you feel most comfortable in the heat of the summer and also the coldest times of winter? What kind of plants can go into that? The more you ask those questions and look for the answers from the landscape, I think the better it all can go. Hope that's helpful, and good luck, and be gentle with the work you do on both the landscape and your own body. Take care.